Hello everyone, I'm delighted to have been asked to do an introductory overview to Mark's Gospel. I spent a few years studying Mark, but particularly from the position of a storyteller. I used to do a show in a pub in London, in Whitechapel, where each month we'd do a little bit of the Gospel, and eventually we put that all together in a first a 4-hour long stage show which we put on at a small theatre in Leicester Square to cover the whole of the Gospel, and then we edited that down a little, keeping the narrative flow, and created a 2-hour show which we toured, a small tour just before I came into this circuit, the Gloucestershire circuit. So I've been asked to share with you some of my thoughts on Mark's Gospel. It works as a story. That's my first point, really. If you've got time, well, not if you've got time, find the time, either before you watch the rest of this or once you've watched it, to just sit down and read the book through, read the whole of Mark's Gospel through, and try and get your head and your heart around the narrative flow. I'll say more about that, but for this short video, I've got together with a friend of mine, the Rev Rob Hilton, who I trained with, who's a superintendent minister up in Alsager way. I can't remember the name of his circuit now. South Cheshire, I think. And the best way for my brain to work is to have a conversation. So Rob and I have had a conversation, and I've tried to edit it down as much as I can. When two ministers get talking, it can go on for some time. And first of all, we talked about the structure of Mark's Gospel, as I talk about it, the narrative flow, and where the turning points in the story are. So we'll hear us talking about that first of all.
Certainly, I read it as a drama. I read it as a novel. It's got that sense of being written with. You engage with it as you read it, don't you? Yeah.
I think of all the Gospels, it's the most narrative in that sense of, to use an almost old-fashioned concept of beginning, middle, and end, and obviously there are sections within that sort of outline. But yeah, Mark works like that, which is one of the things that gives the impression of it being told. To hold the whole narrative together. It doesn't meander off into text and into quotes from other versions of stories, and I'm sure it uses other sources.
So how would you read it from the point of view of those who say that it is Mark collecting all of Peter's preaching material? Do you think that sense of narrative, and certainly the urgency and the drama and the pace at which it moves when you read it as a whole, does that come from Mark gathering Peter's preaching material word for word, or is it Mark's own way of telling the story when he edits it together?
I always get the feel that it's almost what we have is a text that's been taken down as somebody else is performing it, as somebody is reading. Now, whether that person has taken Peter's sermons, has been with Peter for a long time, or has gathered them up and has then juggled them around and created some sort of narrative that they can both work with and remember and speak out publicly. I can see that would work. But I don't think this is I don't feel this is a literary document.
No.
That someone's gathered sermons and notes and written it out like Luke has. I mean, Luke is very much that. You can feel that it's a written text. In fact, there are a couple of times in Mark's Gospel for me when when there's a debate about divorce, when the apocalyptic stuff comes in, you get the feel that that's been uplifted and sort of placed in. Not to say that it shouldn't be there, but that it's somehow is a bit that maybe wasn't quite in performance, but has just been tidied up and made notes on just to make sure it fits with how the community understood it.
But Mark just seems so passionate to tell you a story that he's not, like you say, he's not doing that literary bit. It's just all there in his heart as he pounds his way through a story that moves with such pace, and the content, just like a thriller, the pages turn one after another and the stories tumble out.
But within that, very firmly structured, that you get at the beginning, you get the little prologue of connecting it to the prophets, and that this is a story about one who fits in with Jewish tradition and who is anointed, as it were. But then you've got, from the off, you've got the circular thing of the Galilee thing, and within the Galilee thing, towards the end of it, the preaching of the kingdom of God, and then the reaching out beyond Galilee to the surrounding regions, and then the revelation of who Jesus is for his followers, and then the announcements of the suffering Christ, and then the journey to Jerusalem, and then the denouement, as it were, with the great battle in Jerusalem, or with the authorities leading to his death, and then the epilogue, mystical end that, as I know you speak about this circular feel to it.
Yeah, I mean, it depends where you read it, doesn't it? I think it's quite clear that over the centuries, well, in the early centuries, perhaps the end of Mark's gospel was tampered with. Some people say, well, the last page was lost, so they've rewritten it. Some people say it deliberately just stops and that wasn't comfortable, so people have edited an ending onto it. I think it's quite clear that in most Bibles we've got 2 or 3 different versions of what an ending could be. For me, it stops at chapter 16, verse 8. Frightened women being told, go back to Galilee and that's where you'll see Jesus. And like you say, that's where the gospel, after the opening prologue, that's where it begins.
I mentioned earlier the turning points. I mean, all good stories have these little moments where something changes, whether it be in a novel or whether it be in a film or a play. There's that sense of something, hold on, the mood's different now. And in Mark, there are a couple of times, if not way more than that, where the mood takes a change. Clearly, I mean, one of the classics is when Jesus enters into Jerusalem. There's a very strong feel of we're in a different part of the story now. But here, me and Rob reflect upon 2 key areas for each of us.
Ordinary people getting on with ordinary life in Galilee, and Jesus appears in their midst and teaches them and affects them and changes their lives. And they follow, they go all that through that story into Jerusalem, all the rest of it, death, resurrection. Resurrection leaves them with an almighty mystery. And that's where, if you then go right back to the beginning, you start to read those layers deeper and deeper. Okay, so you and me and our congregations today, we're in our own Galilee. We're in our own lives. And Jesus mysteriously appears in the midst of us. And we start to learn, and life can be changed as we follow him and learn from him. And those layers gradually get peeled back and back. And my favorite moment of that is at the end of, is it chapter 10, where we get the story of blind Bartimaeus, and he's fumbling his way, looking for Jesus. He finds Jesus, who gives him the gift of sight. And then we get into chapter 11, and it's like the hinge on a door. The whole gospel moves one way to the other. Bartimaeus, his eyes are opened. The first thing he sees is the Messiah on a donkey riding into Jerusalem, the Jewish Messiah coming to claim his throne. That's the secret that nobody else has understood. Jesus has denied it and told them when he thinks they've got it, not to tell anybody, because he still wants them to understand it more. And then a blind man, the first thing he sees is the thing that everybody else has been trying to grapple to understand. I think it's just brilliant.
Because it's really interesting that you put a balance point, a tipping point in the story at Bartimaeus and that vision. I mean, he's not the only blind person that receives sight in the story, and I won't drift it into there. But my tipping point is always, well, I'm rubbish at finding chapters. 8, is it? Anyway, the famous Peter's announcement that you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, and that's when we turn from here is a northern Galilean ministry, a learning of of what the kingdom is about and how lives are changed, enriched, made whole, because of the kingdom. And then when Peter says, you are the Christ, then it turns.
And he says Messiah will go to Jerusalem, suffer, be misunderstood, die, be raised again on the third day, and that's when you'll get it. And that happens 3 times, I think, doesn't it? In a bit
classic storytelling technique, and we do it in modern day pantomime. In the theatre, we talk of the rule of 3. It's like you do with a good joke or a good narrative. The rule of 3, once, twice, third time.
It's after those 3 that you then get the blind Bartimaeus, and that. So it's
right.
Chapters 8, 10, 11. It's a massive. It's that middle section, though, isn't it, where the whole thing does move into Galilee, from Galilee into Jerusalem.
Yeah.
One of the points of tension in Mark's Gospel, as people talk about it, is often the need to have a wholly religious document where it's about our salvation, our relationship with God, and how Jesus worked in the world, and what effect he had on the people around him. And then can that be divided from a political story, because if we change the world, that's politics. And it's interesting to look at Mark's Gospel to see where the spiritual and where the political interact, divide, share the same timeline. So again, Rob and I sort of touched upon this.
Throughout, there's been, beautifully painted, and again, it's slightly knowing the situation a bit, this tension between the north and the south, that Israel and Judea are different places. Galilee is not the whole of Israel, and Judea is a different set of different political systems, different understanding. We talk of a north-south divide in Britain, the same sort of thing. The rural north would look very suspiciously upon the wealthy city of Jerusalem and surrounding areas. And so there's this sort of rural ministry that is watched over by Jerusalem through the Pharisees, which then heightens the drama as Jesus decides to walk straight towards Jerusalem. Anybody in their right minds would say to Jesus, don't go there, stay in the north where it's safe, but he walks straight into the lion's den.
But I think that's one of the layers, Phil, isn't it? That as you read the story over and over again, you realise that there's that political edge to it, really, in that Galilee, where you've got ordinary people, northern people, not particularly well educated, but people functioning in their communities, faithful in their own ways, and Jesus comes alongside them, gets to know them, talks to them, casts out the demons, raises the dead once or twice, gathers people around the lakeside, does all the stuff that he does in his stories and his late night conversations with the disciples as he gathers them together. But all the while he's taking these ordinary people and drawing them in, and they start to say, oh, so you're the Jewish Messiah then, is that right? And he goes, no, just don't jump to that. Let me tell you what that means. We get all that stuff about going to Jerusalem, and they've all followed him there. So you've got God appearing amongst these lovely rural people in the north. God goes with them, and they follow the purposes of what God's doing in Jesus into Jerusalem, and they're strike at the very heart of the power structure of the people who are running the religion of the time. Whereas you've got Jesus with those country people already saying, God forgives you. You don't need to go to the temple. Now let's go to the temple and tell them that. And they're not going to like it, and they're going to crucify me for it. But that's the truth that Jesus is standing for, that God loves you, God forgives you, God includes you. And that's the message that's going to blow the religious authorities out of the water.
Throughout Mark's Gospel, whenever the subject of messiahship is brought up, whenever someone declares that Jesus is the Christ, or indeed something happens that indicates that Jesus may well be the one, the promised one, Jesus tries to dampen it down. And so I asked Rob about this sense of the secret Christ, which is a thread that runs through Mark.
Whenever anybody goes near sort of committing themselves to a faithful understanding that Jesus is the Christ. There's a very strong sense of Jesus saying, don't tell anybody about this. Keep it quiet. No, why? Is this not something to be proclaimed and danced in the streets and told to the whole world that we have found the Messiah? Why is there this sense of don't tell anybody that?
Well, my reading is it's back to those that repeated three times, because when you get it and when you understand it, it will take you to Jerusalem. It will lead to misunderstanding. It will lead to the cross. And that's the point when Jesus is saying, if you think you've got it, following me is about taking up your cross, you being misunderstood, you engaging with the authorities. Yes, your dead are raised, your sins are forgiven, you are healed of your diseases, your demons are cast out, but actually you will then follow me for me, it means the cross. And I haven't got a clue what it means for the rest of us. It just means there will be consequences because we will be misunderstood. But I guess I just read he's getting people to that level of, please understand this much before you get any further. And of course, I'm suggesting that Mark and those early Christians, they've had that experience, which is why Mark writes it in to his gospel as he tells the story from his experience. He's not a reporter reporting it as it happens. It's happened to him, and he's writing the history back, but from his own experience.
So there's a certain sense of protection in there of Jesus knowing you don't want to be shouting that now. You're not ready. And we'll come on to the disciples in a minute. I mean, you as disciples are clearly not ready. We often say, I mean, in this world of Twitter and tweeting and whatever, people who put things out there and get themselves famous and they don't want to be, the abuse they receive. And people say you don't actually want to be famous. And some of these reality TV shows, people's reality after the show is that the attention it brings upon them is unwanted and quite dangerous to them. So in some ways, Jesus may be saying, don't start shouting that out because you need a better grasp.
Yes.
But my other layer on that is always I have this angle of thinking, well, it's actually not about me being the Christ that's important. It's the kingdom that's important. Yes. What's important is what I taught you in Galilee.
How long had you been reading Mark's gospel? How much of it had you engaged with before you came to that conclusion that it's actually not about you being the Christ, it's about the kingdom? Did you get that when you were a teenager, when you first became
not at all. No. No, I mean, well, I wasn't at church when I was a teenager, but but when I was brought to church, it was never about that. It was always about the story of atonement. It was all about atonement and the cross, which is fine. Yeah. It's very grateful for it. Yeah. But it wasn't until I started telling Mark's gospel as a whole, and taking it into pubs and to theatres, and trying to really structure what's going on as a narrative. That you go, well, this is very much about. That's why there's such a big section about the kingdom. Yes. Towards the end of the first part, there's a whole long section of Jesus' teaching on the kingdom, and that's what he's taking to Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's a story that invites me in as a disciple. It invites me in personally to relate to Jesus, and it was a whole rediscovery for me. But now, after 8-10 years of that understanding, I've come right back round to understand, that the kingdom, what he was doing in Galilee, the qualities of that community was starting to create in Galilee. And that's what I mean. I think where you just have to go round and round and round and round it again and again, because you find so much more in it as we read it round and round.
And then, of course, it's not just a story of Jesus in isolation. There are people all around him. The disciples are an interesting group, and in Mark particularly, the disciples are seen through the eyes of Peter and James and John as a three that are almost drawn aside from the 12. But who the disciples are, or rather who they are in relationship to Jesus, and particularly who they are in relationship to what he has to say to the good news, to the kingdom, is really interesting, because, well, as you hear in this conversation, throughout the gospel, they are not ideal disciples.
What about these disciples?
Yes.
Because there are some gospels that are about discipleship, and I've heard it said that Matthew's gospel is Mark's gospel. Sorry, I've heard it said that Mark's gospel is somehow about discipleship. And though it might be, it's certainly not a model for good discipleship in terms of if discipleship is the following of Jesus and the grasping the kingdom and his teaching, because consistently, and it's often focused on Peter, James, and John, who are taken aside as if they're almost treated specially. But consistently, whenever Jesus provides a piece of teaching, there's usually a story that follows that shows that the disciples simply haven't grasped it. They haven't understood it, and they've almost done the opposite, whether it be challenging people or healing people, whether it be arguing about who's the greatest, whether it be fighting for Jesus' right to be their leader. It just, whether it be moaning about bread and not understanding the feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000. Yeah.
That's where I think it's totally and utterly subversive, is Mark's gospel, because you've got those three who, and as I say, Mark, if we take the fact that he writes from his own experience in the very, very early church, you've got the disciples that become the 12 apostles, but you've got Peter, James, and John, the three executive, if you like, the people who are really close to Jesus, who are supposed to get it. And yet, who are the people in the gospel stories who do get it? Two frightened women.
The women.
At the end. Little children who their parents say, Jesus, just bless our children, will you? And he says, for such to belongs the kingdom of God. You men, you disciples, you think you've got it. Be like a child.
The women thing is very important, isn't it? I mean, it's very the first, is it the second sort of miracle story? Forgive me. The healing of Peter's mother-in-law. It starts with Jesus.
Yes.
Saying that God's action in this world is for women. And not just the sort of, sadly, the history has it that, well, he heals her so she can serve them. But that's an aside, really. He shows the importance of a woman being healed, as he shows the importance of a 12-year-old girl being healed. He shows the importance of a cast out woman who's nearly dead being healed. He shows that the only people who don't run away at the end are the women. It's very deeply subversive and completely ignored in many ways throughout 2,000 years of Christian history. That in Mark says very prominently, women are as much a part of what God is doing in this world as anybody else. And here we are, two men talking about it.
I know.
Sorry.
I really enjoyed having this conversation with Rob. It would be nice to be in the same room, but hey, things are as they are. But in this conversation, Rob focused on the crowds, which is something I've not really thought of, even though I've told the story many, many times. I'm fully aware of the crowds. And how they build, and for me, there's a sense of Jesus getting frustrated with them almost. That certainly, if not frustrated, then tired, and the need to get away from them. But Rob brings in a new light on the necessity of the crowds in this story, which I hadn't really reflected upon before. So here's Rob. In conversation about the crowds.
You've nearly always got in the story of Mark, the crowds that are watching this happen. They're eavesdropping on the arguments, on the conversation. Sometimes Jesus is talking only to the three, sometimes he's talking only to the 12, but nearly always the story then broadens out or comes from what the crowds have seen. What's the place of the crowds? I mean, I think you've got, when I think that the Galilee is gathering a crowd, and you've got Jesus, you've got the three, you've got the 12, you've got the women. It's like concentric circles around Jesus, and then you've got the crowd. But as we said, it's almost as if the crowd and the women get it and understand it because of what they're seeing and witnessing, and they get enough to follow him into Jerusalem, where all, pardon the expression, all hell is going to break loose, I was going to say, because of the eruption. So you've got the crowds in Jerusalem who are the Jerusalem crowd, but you've got the crowd of pilgrims that have come with Jesus, who are the ones who were shouting and hailing him as Messiah, the ones that Bartimaeus sees when he opens his eyes for the first time. You've got those crowds, and then you see him go to the temple on Palm Sunday, as we call it, and throws the money changers out of the temple. Those crowds are really hungry for what they're seeing. I think those crowds that are following are really, really important, because they've got the whole picture. They can see Jesus, they can hear what he's saying, they can see the disciples' reaction, they can hear what he's saying, they see the children and the effect it has on them. They're the crowd that the women and the children come back into once they're healed, once the demons are cast out, once they've chased him round the lake, you know. And it strikes me that that crowd is what forms the early church.
And that links in once again to the go to Galilee and I will meet you there. Because who is there to be met in Galilee other than those crowds who originally stirred up, who will still want the kingdom, who will still want the stories, who want to know what happened in Jerusalem and what happened to Jesus and what the stories were there. And they will still need to form community around the new stories they've heard. Yeah, that's interesting.
What I had picked up from Mark's Gospel, as I've told it, is this sense of Jesus battling all the time to bring something new to the world, a challenge to the storm, and here I am talking about that.
From a storyteller's point of view, there's a section which is probably my favourite section, but it does fit in with the experience of those people who make up those crowds. Is this, and you use the phrase "all hell breaks loose," and there's this great battle within that first half of the story. Maybe it's echoed by the battles and the trials of Jesus and the passion stories, but certainly it's there where Jesus is accused of being Beelzebub. Jesus is accused of being who is, like Lord Storm can be translated, this sense of the one who controls chaos, or rather doesn't control chaos because it's chaos, though who brings chaos. And there's this little section that goes from Jesus trying to get away from the crowds because of the chaos that's there, the storm blowing up on the lake, and Jesus bringing calm to the chaos of the storm, being met by the man with a legion of demons with him, and Jesus brings calm to this storm that's there, but then has to leave the storm that is causes with the farmers and the locals who are there who want him to leave. As he leaves, he arrives back to another crowd of people, all pushing around him, and he tries to get some calm. In the midst of that storm, a woman comes to him who's dying. He brings calm to her storm, but in that same crowd is met by Jairus, and his daughter is dying. When he gets to Jairus' house, that is filled with a crowd of people all moaning and wailing and screaming, which Jesus has to bring calm to. And there's this whole section where Jesus brings calm to the storm and overcomes the chaos that life can sometimes be, which is, I assume, the experience of those people in those crowds, that actually this is what the kingdom does. The kingdom allows us to communicate with each other in such a way that we start to bring a calm, we start to control, so all hell doesn't break loose. We actually have the power over what some would call hell, or the powers of chaos, Beelzebub himself.
I think I see there a link way back to the opening verses of Genesis, where you've got the beginning of the creation story, and in Jewish thinking, you've got this idea that in the beginning was chaos, and the Spirit of God hovered over the dark waves of the chaos, and the Spirit of God brings order through the days of creation out of that chaos. It's the kingdom of God doing in the chaos of Galilee what the Holy Spirit did in those opening few chapters of Genesis, which is the subversion of Jesus and his movement, saying to the whole of Judaism, this is a renewal movement. We know our sacred stories, we know our understanding of God and the world, and here is Jesus doing it again. get what the Messiah means as this one that comes to fulfill the purposes of God.
Not only does Jesus challenge the sense of chaos, he also challenges the temple system. This is seen clearly as Mark draws the story towards the heart of Jerusalem, and the story of the fig tree that doesn't produce fruit because the season for fruits is over. And he parallels that and weaves that in with his clearing of the temple. And very strong imagery of if you've got a plant that's out of season and is producing no fruit, then maybe its time is over. And this goes hand in hand with his criticism of the temple. Again, Rob and I talked about this.
The storm theory, that if Jesus is deliberately walking into the storm to bring some sort of calm and kingdom, is that an echo of the walk into Jerusalem? That actually there does become a political element to this, that actually the storm as he sees it is caused by wealthy people running a system that does not help the crowds, that does not help the poor. And so he walks straight into the heart of that to challenge the system, particularly challenge the temple system that says you will only find God's forgiveness if you pay. And Jesus from the off is saying you don't have to pay for any of this. It's absolutely free. You are forgiven, which causes the row with the paralyzed man in the early parts of the gospel. But now he's going to the heart of Jerusalem to almost say to the authorities there, as he tries to clear the temple, this is all wrong.
Yeah, this is my Father's house, a house of prayer. What does he say? For many nations, for everybody to come to. Interesting that use of the word many. Not just this is for the Jewish people, this is for many nations. And you've made it a robber's den or something, haven't you, with all your trading and your economy and your taxes and your money changing. And Jesus causes that storm. The other side of that storm, the men run away. 2 frightened women go back to Galilee. That's where you'll see Jesus calming the storms. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I think that the storm calming in the first half is echoed by the storm he causes that he then defeats with death and resurrection in the second one. And go back to Galilee. That's where you'll find him in the kingdom. That's where it is.
And there are so many layers. I mean, you mentioned the house of prayer for all nations. Well, that echoes the story of the kingdom early on, that the mustard seed grows into a tree, which will be populated by all the birds of the air. There are those little echoes all along.
So the power is there in the story of Mark. It's the shortest gospel. It holds together really well, as we've mentioned, many layered and worth going back to again and again and again. I have to say with Mark's gospel, if you think you know what it's about, go and read it again. It doesn't bear well when we bring our theology to it and try and lay it over. We have to tease out what God is doing with this story for us. So look at it as a whole. Please, as I said at the beginning, find time to read it through. There are things we haven't mentioned. We did have a long chat in our conversation about John the Baptist. I missed all of that out. John the Baptist is a very key figure in there. Maybe we should have said more about the women, though we did reference that. The reflections upon Jesus being the Messiah figure that echoes both Moses and Elijah, in the sense of the calling of the people and the healing of the people, the renewal of Israel. There are so many things which we haven't touched upon, but I hope this gives you a taste and an energy to do some work yourselves, to look at Mark's Gospel and find out more about all these very many layers that are there.
And I've just remembered a bit that always underlines the real tension and fear of the story is, I think it's the third time that Jesus proclaims that the Messiah must suffer and die. It then says the disciples hung back from him, for they were frightened to speak to him. And something has come over Jesus. And I think it's to do with John and to do with the story, to do with the challenge and to do with what's about to come, that they're still not getting. But Jesus is presence is such that they're frightened to speak to him now.
And if we Christians in the 21st century, if we haven't sometimes got that sense of awe and fear and flipping at, what does it mean to follow Jesus? What does it mean to acknowledge the kingdom? What is the kingdom? If we haven't got that sense of fear sometimes, then aren't we missing something?
Yeah, that's great, because it balances the whole story, that sense of, yes, sometimes it's about lovely boat trips and bread and fish, in a new revolutionary understanding of the way life can be. But to gain that, Jesus balances it with, well, now are you ready to get to truly challenge the powers that be, so this thing can be a reality for everyone. Oh, it's just endless, Mark's Gospel. Just so much to it.
Bless you in your studies and in your thinking and in your reading. And I hope this has been of some use to you. It's been great exploring once again Mark's Gospel. God bless.